It started with a simple alert: inventory discrepancy detected. David, the manager of the small-town Toys R Us, barely glanced at it. These things happened all the time. Retail systems were finicky, and small errors in the inventory were nothing new, especially as the store prepared for its busiest season. But something about this alert felt odd. It listed item R34526, Darling Daisy doll, as sold. David frowned. That doll hadn't been in stock for decades. It had been discontinued in the late 1970s, long before he'd started working here. He dismissed the alert as a glitch, logged it as resolved, and forgot about it. The next morning, the same alert appeared. Darling Daisy doll, sold at precisely 3:33 a.m. David squinted at the timestamp. The store was locked up tight at that hour. It didn't make sense. He reset the system, confident it was a bug, and moved on with his day. But the alerts didn't stop. Every morning, without fail, the system logged another sale. Same item, same time. David decided to investigate. He dove into the store's inventory records and was surprised to find that the Darling Daisy doll was still listed in the system, but it was flagged as discontinued. According to the records, the last doll had been sold in 1975. There was no reason for it to still be appearing in the system, or worse, being sold. Curiosity gnawed at him. He started asking around, but none of the older employees could remember anything about the doll. One of the cashiers shrugged and said, "Maybe it's just one of those old creepy toys kids used to like. You know, like those porcelain dolls that always look like they're watching you." That night, David decided to stay late. After the last customer left and the store was locked, he pulled up the live security feed on his office computer. The aisles were empty, rows of brightly colored toys sitting under the fluorescent lights. Everything was still. He fast-forwarded to 3:33 a.m. The moment the clock hit that time, the lights in the doll aisle flickered. David leaned closer to the screen as a shadow appeared. It was small, childlike, and seemed to materialize out of nowhere. It moved down the aisle, stopping in front of a shelf that hadn't stocked the Darling Daisy doll in decades. The shadow reached up, its arms impossibly long, and mimed pulling something from the shelf. Then it turned, holding an invisible object, and placed it into an empty shopping cart that hadn't been there moments before. David's blood ran cold as the shadow turned toward the camera. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw glowing eyes, small, faint pinpricks of light. Then the screen cut to static. The following morning, David told no one what he'd seen. He couldn't explain it. He convinced himself it had to be some kind of malfunction in the cameras. Maybe the system was glitching all over the place. But when he arrived in the store, his heart dropped. Sitting in the middle of the doll aisle was a box. It was old, dusty, and battered. The faded lettering on the box read, "Darling Daisy, she'll be your best friend forever." Inside the cracked plastic display window sat the doll. Its porcelain skin was pale, its unblinking black eyes staring straight ahead. Its blonde curls were matted, and its smile, once meant to be sweet, seemed to curl into something more sinister. David stepped closer, heart pounding. The air around the box felt cold, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. He picked it up, and as he turned the box over, he noticed something scrawled on the inside of the packaging, just beneath the doll. The writing was jagged, almost clawed into the cardboard. It read, "You sold me. Now I sell you." David dropped the box and stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But when he looked back, the box was gone. He scanned the aisle, his heart racing, but there was no sign of the doll or the box. That night, David stayed again. This time, he patrolled the aisles with a flashlight. The store was quiet, unnervingly so. Even the faint hum of the lights seemed muted. As the clock ticked toward 3:33 a.m., the air grew cold. The lights in the doll aisle began to flicker. Then he heard it. A soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike. It echoed through the aisles, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. David gripped his flashlight tighter, his palms slick with sweat. He turned a corner and froze. The doll was there again. It wasn't in its box this time. It was standing upright, its tiny porcelain hands resting on the edge of a shelf. Its head tilted slightly, and though it had no moving parts, David swore the doll's smile widened. "Who's there?" David called out, his voice trembling. The only response was another giggle, louder this time, distorted and wrong. He bolted toward the stockroom, slamming the door shut behind him. He pressed his back against it, his chest heaving. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed outside, growing louder. The giggling turned into whispers, unintelligible but insistent. Then they stopped. David turned to find the doll sitting on the stockroom table. Its black eyes stared into his, unblinking. The smile on its face was impossibly wide now, exposing tiny, sharp teeth. "Forever means forever," a voice whispered. It was faint but unmistakable, and it didn't come from the doll. It came from the shadows surrounding him. The lights went out. When the morning staff arrived, they found the store in chaos. Shelves were overturned, toys scattered everywhere, and the security cameras had been torn from the walls. David's office was empty. His belongings were untouched. The only clue was an entry in the inventory system. Item number 34526, Darling Daisy Doll. Sold to David, 3:33 a.m. The store shut down shortly after. It became a local legend, a place people dared each other to visit. Those who peeked through the dusty windows swore they saw something moving in the aisles, and if you stayed long enough, you could hear faint giggling, high-pitched and echoing in the silence. Years later, when the building was finally demolished, workers found a single Darling Daisy doll buried beneath the rubble. Its porcelain face was pristine, its black eyes unblinking, and etched inside the packaging in jagged letters was a single phrase, "She'll be your best friend forever." No one ever claimed the doll. I've worked at Toys R Us for 6 years, and I used to love it. Sure, it's a dead-end retail job, but there was something nostalgic about walking through aisles filled with toys that reminded me of being a kid. That was before I found the door. It all started during inventory prep for the holiday rush. We were missing a shipment of action figures, a big deal with the holidays coming up, and the system said they were in the storage room. I was the assistant manager, so it was my job to find them. I spent hours in that cramped, dusty space, digging through box after box of old stock. The deeper I went into the room, the more oppressive it felt. The air was heavier, colder, like the ventilation didn't quite reach the back corner. That's when I saw it, the door. It was tucked behind a stack of old shelving units and forgotten decorations. I don't know how I'd never noticed it before. It was small, metal, and out of place, with no handle or keyhole, just smooth steel and a faint seam. Something about it gave me a chill, like it didn't belong there. When I pressed my hand against the surface, it was icy cold, even though the storage room itself was warm. I mentioned it to Kyle, our store manager, the next day. He waved it off like it was nothing. "This building's old as hell, probably just an old maintenance closet or something," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it. I decided to check it out after closing. That night, I brought Mia and Jake with me. Mia was a cashier and Jake worked in stock, but we were close and I trusted them. Jake brought a crowbar. It took us a while to pry the door open. The metal groaned like it hadn't been touched in decades, and when it finally swung inward, the stench hit us. It was a mix of mildew, rot, and something sweet like decaying flowers. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely more than a closet, but the air was so cold I could see my breath. The walls were covered in faded pastel wallpaper, peeling at the edges and stained with what looked like water damage, or worse. The floor was littered with old toys, rusty metal cars, stuffed animals with torn seams and leaking yellowed stuffing, and porcelain dolls with cracked faces and missing limbs. A tiny rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint chipped and flaking. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but it still swayed slightly, as if it had just been pushed. I felt something tighten in my chest as I stepped closer. The room felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. "What the hell is this place?" Mia whispered. Her voice echoed faintly, too loud in the tiny room. I didn't answer. My flashlight beam landed on a wooden block on the floor, its faded letters spelling out FUN. That's when I noticed something else, the sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the creaking of the rocking horse, but then it grew louder. It was faint, high-pitched, and unmistakable. Laughter. Children's laughter, echoing all around us. We froze. I felt my stomach twist as the laughter grew louder, overlapping voices that didn't belong to any living child. "We need to leave," I said, backing toward the door. Mia and Jake didn't argue. We shut the door behind us and bolted, but just as we stepped away, I heard a distinct click. The door had locked itself. The next day, things got stranger. Mia came to me during lunch, pale and shaking. "The stuffed animals," she stammered. They moved." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I was stocking shelves and I turned around and they were all on the floor. Every single one. And when I put them back..." She trailed off, her voice cracking. "They were facing me. All of them." I tried to laugh it off, but later that day I saw it for myself. I was walking through the doll aisle when I noticed one of the porcelain dolls sitting on the edge of the shelf, its head tilted as if it were watching me. I'd passed that shelf 10 minutes earlier, and it had been empty. My heart pounded as I bent down to pick it up. For a moment, I swore its lips twitched. That night, I stayed late to review the security footage. At first, everything seemed normal, just hours of empty aisles. But then, at exactly 2:33 a.m., the camera in the doll aisle flickered. When it came back on, one of the porcelain dolls was sitting in the middle of the floor. No one had touched it. There was no one else in the store. And then the laughter started again. It wasn't coming from the footage, it was coming from the storage room. My stomach dropped as I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the back. The closer I got to the door, the colder the air became. By the time I reached it, my breath was fogging in front of me. I hesitated before opening it. My instincts screamed at me to walk away, but I couldn't stop myself. The toys inside were different this time. They weren't scattered. They were arranged in a circle, all facing the door. The rocking horse swayed back and forth, even though there was no breeze. My flashlight flickered and the laughter grew louder. I slammed the door shut and ran. The next day, Jake decided to spend the night in the store. He said he wanted to prove we were all imagining things, but I think he just wanted to show off. Mia and I stayed outside, too scared to join him. Around 3 a.m., his voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "Guys, you need to come see this." When we reached the storage room, Jake was standing in front of the door, pale and shaking. "It's open," he said. The door was ajar, a faint light spilling out from the room beyond. The sound of children's laughter was deafening now, echoing through the room and into the storage area. Jake stepped inside and I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "We need to leave." But he shrugged me off and walked into the room. The toys moved. The dolls stood on their own, their cracked faces twisted into wide, unnatural grins. Stuffed animals twitched, their button eyes gleaming. The rocking horse slammed against the floor, rocking violently on its own. "They just want to play," Jake said, his voice hollow. Before I could stop him, the door slammed shut behind him. Mia and I pounded on the door, screaming his name, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter reached a fever pitch, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. When we opened the door, the room was empty. Jake was gone. The police didn't believe us. When they arrived, there was no door, just a solid wall where it had been. The store closed a month later, but I can't stop thinking about Jake, about the toys, about the laughter. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, faint and distant, like it's calling me back. And I'm terrified one day I might answer. Working the night shift at Toys R Us seemed like the perfect job. Quiet, laid back, and no screaming kids or pushy parents to deal with. But there's something about being alone in a store at 3 a.m. surrounded by rows of lifeless toys that can make even the most logical person uneasy. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, curses, urban legends, none of it ever bothered me. Until the night everything changed. I'd been working there for about a month when the strange things started happening. At first, it was little stuff. Lights flickering in aisle 16, the toy aisle, more often than in any other part of the store, toys falling off the shelves when no one was around. I chalked it up to faulty wiring and gravity. It's an old building, I told myself. Stuff like that happens. But then came the sounds. It was the middle of my second week on the night shift when I first heard it. I was in the back, going over inventory logs, when a faint melody drifted through the store. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, a high-pitched mechanical jingle. It was the kind of cheerful tune you'd expect from an old wind-up toy, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The sound was coming from aisle 16. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed over, expecting to find some battery-operated toy malfunctioning. As I approached the aisle, the music stopped. I shined the beam of my flashlight down the long row of shelves, but everything was still. Just action figures, dolls, and stuffed animals staring blankly back at me. I walked up and down the aisle, checking every shelf, but there was nothing. No loose toys, no blinking lights, no explanation. I told myself it must have been a glitch in the store's PA system and went back to my post. The music came back the next night, and the next. Always from aisle 16, always stopping as soon as I got close. Sometimes it wasn't just music. I'd hear the faint sound of wheels rolling or the quiet giggle of a child. Every time I checked the aisle, it was empty. Still, I dismissed it as my imagination until I caught it on the cameras. It was late, probably close to 2 a.m., and I was half asleep in the office when I noticed the monitor for aisle 16 flickering. The toys on the shelves looked normal at first, but then I saw it, a small red ball rolling into view. Slowly, methodically, it moved down the aisle, stopping dead center. My stomach tightened as I rewound the footage. There was no one there. The ball seemed to move on its own. I watched the footage again, and this time I noticed something else. The dolls on the shelf had shifted. When the ball rolled into view, the dolls that had been slumped against the glass suddenly sat upright, their unblinking eyes staring directly at the camera. I slammed the laptop shut and sat there in silence, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. The next day, while restocking shelves, I overheard two customers whispering near the registers. "It's the toys, I'm telling you," one of them said. "Every kid that's gone missing had one from that aisle." I froze. "Missing kids?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The woman nodded. 3 kids this year alone, all from this area. They all own toys from aisle 16. Creepy, right? She laughed nervously, but her words stuck with me. That night, I searched local news archives and found out she was right. 3 children had gone missing over the past year, all within 10 miles of the store. No witnesses, no leads. The only connection was chilling. In every photo the families released, the kids were holding the same toy, a pale blue plush rabbit with an unsettlingly wide grin. Its name was Hoppy. I didn't even remember seeing that toy in the store, so I decided to check the shelves in aisle 16. There it was, tucked away on the bottom shelf. Rows of identical blue rabbits, their glossy black eyes catching the light. I picked one up, turning it over in my hands. The tag read, "Hoppy, he'll be your best friend forever." Something about it made my skin crawl. From that night on, everything escalated. The sounds grew louder, more frequent. I'd hear laughter echoing through the aisles, the squeak of wheels, toys activating on their own. The air in aisle 16 grew cold, sharp enough to see my breath. And then the shadows came. It started with flickers at the corner of my vision, but one night as I turned into aisle 16, I saw it clearly. A small, childlike figure darting past the shelves. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I walked cautiously down the aisle, like my flashlight beam bouncing off the glossy packaging. That's when I noticed one of the Hoppy rabbits was missing. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I went through the store's records and found something even stranger. The Hoppy Rabbit wasn't listed in our inventory. It hadn't been part of any stock order, and yet there it was, lined up neatly on the shelves. It didn't make sense. I kept digging and uncovered an old article about the land where the store was built. Decades ago, it had been part of a ranch owned by a man named Jonathan Yates. He'd been a drifter, known for crafting toys out of scraps he found on the property. But Yates wasn't a kind-hearted toy maker. He was a killer. The remains of 5 children had been found buried on his land, but his toys, the ones he made for his victims, were never recovered. I should have quit right then and there, but something about the mystery kept pulling me back. I had to know the truth, even if it killed me. The last night I worked there started like any other, quiet, uneventful. I avoided aisle 16 as much as I could, but around 2 a.m., the laughter started again. It was louder this time, almost mocking. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the aisle. The air was freezing, the kind of cold that cuts straight to your bones. My breath came out in sharp, ragged gasps as I turned the corner. The aisle was empty, but the toys were different. The Hoppy Rabbits had all turned to face the center of the aisle, their wide grins stretched impossibly wide. I heard a creak behind me and spun around. The red ball from the security footage was sitting at my feet. Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out. The store was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own panicked breathing. Then I saw it. A shadow, small and childlike, standing at the far end of the aisle, its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were studying me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow took a step forward, then another. The closer it got, the colder the air became. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as the shadow closed the distance. When it finally reached me, I saw its face. It wasn't a child at all. It was Hoppy. The rabbit's glassy eyes locked onto mine, and its stitched grin seemed to widen. The last thing I heard was the faint sound of the mechanical jingle, cheerful and relentless, echoing through the store. They found me in the morning, lying in the middle of aisle 16, surrounded by Hoppy Rabbits. They were all smiling. I never went back to that store. Last I heard, it closed down after another child went missing. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear that jingle. It's faint, but it's there, just waiting for me to answer. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these Toys R Us horror stories. If you did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. I'll be posting twice a week with more haunting content. Hit the bell icon so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Your support helps so much, so thank you, and I'll see you in the shadows.